This poem, An Afternoon Nap by Arthur Yapp, is a really nice one. I never actually heard of Arthur Yapp before I read this poem, but I got really into him after reading this one, and I found him really quite an interesting background. So he's kind of Singaporean, but he moved to England and he ended up being a university professor at Leeds University. And yeah, he had a really interesting kind of life, and his poetry is really beautiful, really interesting, quite experimental, kind of like very good modernist poetry. So if you like modernist poetry, I recommend reading more of his poems. So we're going to look at this one. Sounds like quite a nice poem from the title, An Afternoon Nap. I thought it was going to be like, nice, cozy, sleepy poem. Unfortunately not. It's sort of the opposite tone from what you're expecting. So we can see that the title is a little bit ironic. So, yeah, we've got the ambitious mother across the road is at it again. So basically, we've got a speaker who is a curtain twitcher. He's kind of a nosy neighbour, basically. He's watching what's going on his street. And he's watching a mother across the road who's ambitious. She's aspirational. She wants a lot out of her children. She wants them to achieve and succeed in life. And she's got high aspirations for them. She's proclaiming her goodness, but she beats the boy. So she's talking about how great she is as a mother, how much of a good person she is, how her heart is in the right place, her interests are aligned with his success. But she's beating the boy. She's shouting at him. She's criticizing his mediocre report book grades, and she goes on like this throughout the rest of the poem. So basically, we've got a juxtaposition between what a parent thinks is the right thing to do in their head, and then the real life effect of how that's affecting their child. And yeah, you might have come across this kind of parent or experienced this, hopefully not as much of an extreme way as this, but we all have this thing with parents where they usually do want what's best for us. Most people's parents do. And they also have their idea of how we should be, or how we should live our lives, or how we should succeed. Sometimes that's projection from their own lives and things that went wrong in their own experiences that they really want to correct within their children. So if you see parents, as really trying hard to support you and nurture you and guide you in the right direction, you can usually understand why they're behaving in a way that they are. But that doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. So sometimes there's a huge disjunction between what a parent wants for a child and what the child wants for themselves. And you can see that happening here with this boy. So it's quite, in some ways, a slightly kind of bizarre comic situation, because it's almost like, watching a film play out in front of you. There's just a neighbour who's nothing to do with the scene, just watching this unfold in front of him. And in other ways, it's a quite a shocking, harrowing scene. Your interpretation of how serious or how upsetting this poem is will definitely be relative to your own background. So I'm not from the same type of Asian background as Arthur Yapp, but I have like a kind of half Indian, half Pakistani, and half English background. And so my Indian Pakistani side of the family, they absolutely would push me very, very hard when I was young to achieve high grades and always do well. And if I didn't do well, I get in trouble, and so on. So it's a very familiar scenario to me, and it probably will be for anyone from an Asian background or from any sort of culture where it's very important that you get good grades and you do well. Obviously, it worked with me because I became a teacher, so it's not necessarily a bad way to parent, but it can feel overbearing, it can feel intense, especially if you're not quite getting the grades that your parents expect you to get, or you're not really responding well to the education system, or to the type of parenting that your parents give. So yeah, you can see that these are the sorts of themes and ideas that are happening in this poem. There's a lot of interesting vocab, so you might want to just pause, write down, and have a quick look at this vocab as you read through the poem as well. So I recommend just kind of sitting, reading the poem, looking at imagery, trying to figure out both perspectives, because there's a way you can read this poem where the mother is evil and the boy is a victim. You can read it the other way where the boy is lazy and the mother is just desperate and trying to help him. I personally see it as in the middle. I see the boy as doing the best he can, but struggling, and equally the mother the same, doing the best she can, but struggling. So I see it as a kind of tragic type poem. But the perspectives are deliberately a little bit removed to help us project our own interpretation onto what's happening. So I'd like you to read the poem through aloud to yourself and just jot down a few notes about your own beliefs about the poem. Do you like the mother? Do you like the boy? Do you kind of feel sorry for both of them? Do you think it's both their fault? You can kind of jot down your opinion, your stance on the poem. So yeah, once you've done that, we're going to move on and have a look a little bit more in detail at the kind of events of the poem. So there's a few things that the boy's doing. We can see that his life is overwhelmed, really. There's a piano lesson. There's English as a second language lessons. He has average school grades, mediocre grades. He has tutors who turn up and they take money from the money box and they exchange that money for knowledge, and he gets music, language analysis. There's not really much money left in this family for the boy to have any fun or to buy anything that he would like. And he's bitter, so there's a sort of parallel structure you can see where the first stanza mirrors the last stanza, and they're kind of copying each other. And it's kind of about this cultural loops that we can get stuck in, where the mother is also a product of her society and her culture. The expectations placed upon her by her own parents will be transferred. She'll be doing what she thinks culturally is the right thing to do, and behaving in a way that she was also raised in. So we can see that the pressure placed upon certain individuals is leads them to act in a harsh way and to cause undue suffering to others in a way. So yeah, he has a go at her for her expensive taste for education, because it feels like the education is not really helping him. He definitely needs a break. He needs a little bit of his own fun time, his own money, his own independence. It's quite a claustrophobic and fraught atmosphere. The main theme is kind of ambition, parenting, or the relationship between parents and children, perhaps academic pressure as well. Yap, coming from a Singaporean background, you can feel like this is absolutely the type of environment that he was exposed to and that he grew up in himself. So there's quite a lot of language features here. If you want to spend a bit more time on those, you can go to the Scribbly page, download the document, have a look through. I'm going to just go a little bit more into the structure. So it's almost regular, which I think echoes the regularity of the boy's days and his weeks, and the way that his life is really measured out and scheduled. And the final couple of stanzas start to break this with the lines being added, or the line length being modified a little bit, and it's suggesting the kind of tension that is going to rupture and eventually turn into a full-blown argument where something changes. It's not a sustainable situation that they're stuck in now. So I think it's really clever to make the structure almost regular with a little bit of rupture that's kind of foreshadowing, a severe break from this routine. This is a really cute picture of Arthur Yap. He looks nice, I think. It's like a nice kind of very shy guy. I think he's, from reading about him, super quiet, very very introverted, loved reading. He's really playful in his poetry, but in real life a really quite reserved type person. So yeah, it's about this kind of British and Asian cultural fusion, which you actually naturally get in Singapore anyway. So there's a really interesting language in Singapore called Singlish, which is a pidgin language made up of a few different Asian languages and English. And you can see the influence of Singlish in this poem. So the way that the grammar is a little bit weird, there might be some random words that you don't quite recognize as an English speaker because they're from a Chinese or Indian origin. So it's a Creole language, a mixture of a few different languages blended together. And Yap's choice to use this Singlish is really integral to the poem. So I recommend that you get really familiar with that point, because it helps you to understand this kind of cultural fusion, which is the same background that Yap came from himself. So there's some interesting critical interpretations as well of Yap's poetry in general. You might want to pause and kind of apply these to the poem. And there's some interesting kind of comments there, very positive comments. Anthony Burgess in particular is one of my favourite writers, so he really liked Yap. So that's quite cool. So we've got some quite interesting messages here that I'm just going to quickly go through. So parents do want what's best for us, but it may not always be what we think is best for us, or even what genuinely is best. There are exceptions, obviously, with parents. Not every parent does want what's best for their children, but as a general rule, most of the time, most people's parents do care about their children, and they do really want what is best for them. So those kinds of arguments that occur with parents are more about a child asserting their own independence and deciding that what the parent thinks is right is actually not right. So that dialogue, in a way, is quite healthy between a parent and child, where the child resists and tries to kind of push back and say what they actually feel like they need, rather than just what the parent thinks they should do. Especially mothers in Asian cultures, they feel under pressure. They're very much, not all of them, but it's quite traditional still to take a kind of, traditional kind of housewife role in Asian cultures. My grandma is an example of this. So my grandfather ran businesses and he worked all the time, constantly. My grandmother cooked constantly. She raised all the children. Then she raised all the grandchildren. So I used to live with her at the weekends. And and she's pushy, like crazy hardline, crazy pushy, very strict, because that's like her full-time job, and that's her success, and her sense of worth was measured on how well she managed to get her children to achieve, and her grandchildren even. So these Asian sort of cultural norms can feel a little bit unusual, overbearing, if you look at them from a Western perspective. Most of my friends who were just British and they didn't have a mixed race heritage, they really didn't understand my family and the way that they put pressure on me. But you do get British families that are similar. One of my best friends, actually, his whole family were doctors. They were all very, very British, always from the same place. And because his whole family were doctors, they were all really intelligent, they were all really high achieving. There's enormous pressure on him, the same as me, to achieve well. So it's not necessarily, a kind of cultural thing. It might just be a class thing. It might be a personal thing to your family and your family traditions as well. So there's a sense that, rebellion comes from pressure and oppression. This boy's feeling pressed into a certain structure that doesn't suit him, and it's wearing him down, and it's leading him to breaking point. He doesn't seem like he's a bad child. He seems like he's trying really hard, but he needs to be rebellious in order to assert his own boundaries. So it helps us understand that tension between child and parent, that tension between oppression and rebellion, and why those things occur, why sort of pressure builds up and it has to eventually erupt into an argument or a conflict. And finally, I think so Yap is a highly academic person. He got a lot of scholarships. His family were not so academic, and he really worked his way up through the academic system to become a professor. So he's a very, very, studious person who did well at school. But the poem is about people who don't necessarily do as well at school, because not because they don't try or because they're not intelligent, but just because they don't suit academia and school settings. Not everyone's strengths lie in the same place. Not everyone is academic. And I think a really important message of the poem is that we shouldn't force people into academia if they feel like that is not their calling in life. That's not how they're, how they're supposed to be. So the sun is unresponsive. My dog's my dog's here in the room, and he's dreaming and making really weird noises. So if you can hear strange background noises, that's what it is. Sorry. The son's unresponsive, not because he's a bad child or because he's stupid or anything like that. He's unresponsive because he's pressured into something that doesn't suit him. And so human nature is important. Individuality is important. Everybody's own measure of success is important too. So instead of success being, A stars and top grades, obviously the entire point of my my school that I build and my website here, Scribbly, and my YouTube channel, if you're watching it on YouTube, the whole point of all of these videos that I make is to get people to get A stars and do really well at school. But that is not the be all and end all. That's not the only thing that measures your success in life. It's unique and personal to each individual. And if you follow your own personal strengths and interests in life, you end up at a really good spot. And if you force yourself into being things that are not true to your nature, you'll end up like this poor boy in this poem, where you're too pressured and you feel like you need to rebel. So that's a very important fundamental message of the poem, which I really agree with, despite also being a teacher myself. So hopefully you're feeling quite positive about this poem. You find it interesting. You probably find it relatable in some way. So try and, cross-reference it against your own life, your own experience with your parents or authority figures, such as teachers. And maybe jot down your own thoughts and opinions on how important school is for you, how important academia is, whether you're happy with your weekly routines or not, that kind of thing. So it's a good poem for self-reflection. Thank you very much for listening. Go to scribbly.com if you want more lesson resources, videos, that kind of thing. And hopefully I'll see you guys soon in a future video. Bye for now.